Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Scully. I'm president of People's Action for Clean Energy, and together with the Connecticut Energy Network, we are particularly pleased to host today's webinar, Laying the Groundwork for an Equitable Modern Grid. Today's event features Marissa Gillette, chairman of the Connecticut Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, or PURA, and Jonathan Steinberg, Westport State Representative and House Chair of the Energy and Technology Committee. We could not imagine anyone better than these two to speak to us about the future of our electric grid. Marissa Gillette was brought to Connecticut in April of 2019 and has just completed her first term as chairman of PURA. Previously, she worked at the Maryland Public Service Commission, their equivalent of our PURA. She has degrees in engineering and law, a unique combination and one particularly well suited to utility regulation. In her first term, she has brought an outsider's perspective, a burst of activity, and fresh ideas to the agency. She's won several victories on behalf of ratepayers, reining in what courts have deemed excessive utility rate increase requests. She's tightened and enforced rules meant to shield PURA employees from utility influence. She has at every juncture sought to demystify the work of PURA and gone out of her way to increase and broaden participation in its proceedings. Chairman Gillette was hired by Government Lamont to be an agent of change and has sought to foster innovation, modernization, and performance consistent with the state's clean energy goals. It's important here to note the unique role that a utility regulator plays. As we all know, we agreed over 100 years ago that we don't want multiple utilities setting up multiple electric grids, so we made our utilities monopolies. As a result, Eversource and United Illuminating do not have to compete on a daily basis for their customers, and they do not face the market pressure to innovate that businesses in competitive industries face. Therefore, it's the role of a utility regulator to act as a proxy for the free market, to defend the interests of ratepayers and foster innovation and change. This is in no way a criticism of utilities, but rather a reflection of the realities of a regulated monopoly. Jonathan Steinberg was first elected to the General Assembly in 2010 and has been a tireless and effective advocate for Connecticut's transition to clean energy. He has degrees in psychology and marketing and has had a career in marketing with several Fortune 100 companies. We've invited Representative Steinberg to engage with Chairman Gillette in a reprise of the fireside chat they conducted at a similar webinar we hosted in 2020, and we're thrilled that he has accepted. As the title of today's webinar suggests, the focus of today's conversation is the work that PURA is doing to create an equitable, affordable, and modern electric grid. It's clear that today's grid needs modernization, particularly in light of the transition to renewables, electric vehicle adoption, heat pump adoption, a resurgent manufacturing industry, and new technologies such as AI data centers. A common argument by opponents of these technologies is that the grid can't handle it. And I think we can all agree they're right. Today's grid cannot handle these increased electric loads and increased complexity of grid resources. The good news is that PURA, under Chairman Gillette's direction, has been hard at work fostering the innovation and change required to build the grid we will need. We all look forward to learning more about this good work. Thank you for joining us, Chairman Gillette.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, Mark. And I want to thank all of the members of PACE and everyone who brought us here today. Really happy to spend the lunch hour talking to you about really vital work that the agency is engaging in with many stakeholders. And going to turn in just a second to the slide deck. As Mark mentioned, we are going to make the slides available along with the recording through our friends at PACE. So there are a number of hyperlinks in this slide deck that will take you to additional resources, and look forward to your questions and to the discussion with Representative Steinberg in just a few moments here. So recognizing how many folks were able to join us this afternoon, I'm sure that we have a range of not only perspectives, but familiarity with PURA as an agency, the way we do our work, and the types of work that we're undertaking. So I'm going to try to thread the needle in terms of how much time that I spend on background regarding PURA. And I'll just flag that If you haven't been able to participate in a Pura 101 roadshow before, we've been out in communities working with partners in the community to it's about an hour long presentation that tries to explain who Pura is, how to interact with us, tackle some frequently asked questions. We do have a recorded version of that presentation available on our YouTube site. So if you're looking for a deeper dive on some of what I'm going to briefly cover this morning, I'd encourage you to go check out that recording. But for now, I'll just start with a very brief introduction to Pura. This slide quickly touches on the most common things that we interact with. I think these days when people hear about Pura, to the extent that you know what Pura is, you might most frequently interact with us when there is a rate case or a request to increase rates, be it on the supply side or the distribution side. But that's by no means the extent of the work that Pura and its stakeholders tackle. There are quite a variety of things that we interact with. And while rate cases are often our most important work, there's a lot else that goes on from a day-to-day basis, including the topics that we're touching on the screen here. So what are some of those topics besides rate cases? We've listed them here on the screen. Increasingly, as Mark alluded to in the introduction, we've been spending a lot of time over the past couple of years of my tenure focused on customer education and outreach. This can look like anything from teaching customers how to read their electric bills. There was an effort to redesign residential electric bills that has now gone live for both Eversource and UI customers. So we've put a lot of emphasis into explaining to customers the basics of how to read their bill, what the cost drivers are of different aspects of your bill, who regulates or doesn't regulate different portions of your bill. A lot of emphasis on explaining to customers how to interact with us. And, I view that as increasingly important as we're going to touch on for the majority of my presentation, moving into more of a customer-centric grid, be that deploying distributed energy resources or interacting more with your data. It's important that we all start from the same page in terms of understanding the basics of the system now and how to read those bills as a start. Other things that we do outside of rate cases, we interact with the utilities as they respond to major storm events. Also work on things related to the electric poles. We had a couple of dockets in the past year or two focused on dealing with structurally compromised poles, things like double poles that you may see in your community. We also interact with the water industry to a lesser degree, focused primarily on the customers of Aquarion and Connecticut Water. There are lots of things that go on between rate cases. Sometimes, though, it's easier to explain Pura by talking about what we don't do. While we do get an increasingly large percentage of customer calls, frustrated with aspects of their cable or internet service, cell phone providers, all of these things in the telecommunications space are unfortunately outside of our purview. So while we're always happy to help connect customers to those companies, we do not do anything with the pricing or services in those areas. We also do not deal with heating oil companies and solar panel installers. Now, this is interesting, and we'll touch on that in the remainder of the presentation, because we do interact with the programs that the state has decided to stand up with respect to deploying and incentivizing the deployment of both rooftop and grid scale solar. But the installers themselves are not regulated, at least not currently by Pura. So just to touch briefly on Pura as an agency, if you've interacted with other state agencies, I'd say that Pura is pretty unique, both in terms of our setup, our role, the way we interact with other agencies. We're much more like a court. So that's sometimes why you hear us described as quasi-judicial. Um, while I am the chair of the agency, which means that all the administrative functions report up through me. I have two colleagues who you may have interacted with previously on the screen, the Vice Chairman Jack Bukowski and Commissioner Michael Karen, both of whom have been long tenured commissioners at PURA and have developed specialties during their service. So when it comes to making decisions that come out of PURA, we each have an equal vote. So if you've interacted with court system before, it looks a lot like what an en banc appellate court might look like, where all three commissioners are sitting for hearing a case that's put on before us, and we each get an equal vote in terms of the decision making. So this past year, and we do have a link in this presentation to our annual report, just to give you a flavor of what this looks like on an annual basis for PURA, pulled together some, PURA by the numbers, continuing the analogy that I was talking about just a second ago with PURA operating and looking a lot like a court. All the work that PURA does is completed through what's known as a docket or a proceeding. Those terms are used pretty interchangeably. And in the course of a proceeding or a docket, we can have a lot of different opportunities for stakeholder engagement. We have evidentiary hearings. We offer opportunities to provide comment in writing. Depending on the type of the proceeding, we will sometimes go into the communities, in evening hours, lunchtime, to seek comment directly from members of the public. And so lots of different opportunities to engage with us throughout the year. And you can see on the screen the number of different ways we interacted with stakeholders in 2023. Other numbers on this screen are some of the fines issued. You may wonder, what's the output of a PURA proceeding? And what's the relevance of us acting like a court? And the relevance is that for the utilities that we regulate, and these are the investor-owned utilities, for the utilities that we regulate, decisions that we issue in these dockets or proceedings are legally binding and create directives or orders that the utilities must follow, along with our other stakeholders. And we do have enforcement authority, and that can take the form of fines. So we've got some numbers up on the screen in terms of what that looked like. Most notably dealing with enforcement authority over gas pipeline safety and call before you dig violations in 2023. So before I get more into the substance of the matter, I did want to pause. We spend a lot of time on this in the PURA 101 proceeding, but ways to engage with PURA. And again, that PURA 101 proceeding spends quite a lot of time trying to convince folks of the importance of engaging in PURA proceedings. I recognize many names on the screen, and many of you are definitely strong contributors to the legislative process, and I'm sure Representative Steinberg is quite thankful for that, grateful for that, and that is obviously of great importance. But also say and continue to encourage folks that engaging at PURA is just as important. And we're trying to break down the barriers and ways in which you can interact with us. We are a creature of statute. So when a statute is passed, whether that looks like asking PURA to study something or implement something or design a program, once that leaves the legislature and comes over to PURA, it's not the end of the road. In fact, we continue to need to hear from folks about how that task should be completed. So there's a range of ways in which you can engage with us. We've seen many of you on public comment hearings in the past. We do offer public comment hearings by Zoom, and as I mentioned before, do go into the communities. We also take comment in writing. And the good news for folks is that from an evidentiary perspective, Whether you want to comment to us verbally or in writing, it carries the same weight for purposes of our proceedings. So it's really a personal preference as to how you want to engage with us. And we take comments on everything and anything that we're doing. Definitely look forward to engaging with you in that way. Of course, there are opportunities to formally intervene in proceedings before PURA as well. Additionally, we're trying to make our work more transparent. So you can sign up for notifications on any dockets that we're working on. There are between 80 and 100 active proceedings at PURA at any given time. So we certainly don't intend for you to have to monitor all 80 to 100. I'll talk about at the end of the presentation ways that you can narrow in on dockets that are of interest to you. And we do have some slides and tutorials. Again, these slides will be circulated if it's of interest to you. Our case management system is definitely a sore spot in terms of being difficult to navigate. So we have put some resources into recording tutorials about how to access these materials. Because again, everything that PURA does is, for the most part, extremely public. I can only think of 2 hearings that I've held in the 5 years that were done in confidential session, which means that everything else that we're using and relying on to reach decisions is publicly available in our case management system, including comments that we receive from members of the public. So in an effort to encourage more robust participation in our dockets, I want to spend a moment talking about a very new program, new as in this quarter it has launched, and we are still waiting for our first applicant. So this is called the Stakeholder Compensation Program. And again, just to take a step back for a moment, the importance of participating in PURA proceedings cannot be emphasized enough. As we are a quasi-judicial body, we can only make decisions based on the evidence put in the record before us. So the very simple example I always use, and if you've heard me do the PURA 101, I apologize, I don't have an updated example to provide. But, if we were having a proceeding on what color the sky was, and and I know that the sky is almost always blue, but the evidence in the record before us says from one party that the sky is orange, and the other says it's green. I could not make a decision finding that the sky is blue because no one has put evidence into my docket that would allow me to support my decision that the sky is blue. So while that's a very basic example of the importance of engaging in our proceedings, I hope it is illustrative. And while we do read, I read every comment that is submitted to us, there are more thorough ways to engage with us, and that can look like actually becoming a formal participant, formal intervener in the dockets before us. And that's historically been a bar that many folks aren't able to cross because it's expensive to retain an attorney. It's expensive to understand how to engage in the proceeding, to retain an expert witness, to formulate cross-examination questions, or recognize that that is a high bar. And one way that we have worked with the legislature through legislation last session to overcome that is to authorize the Stakeholder Compensation Program, which allows up to $100,000 per proceeding for a stakeholder group to intervene in a PURA proceeding to represent their unique viewpoint. So folks that are eligible to participate are those that represent financial hardship customers, which is the statutory term for low income. Also those who are representatives of environmental justice communities, and those that are representative of small business customers. So there are materials available on our dedicated website. There is up to $1.2 million of funding available per year. And this is available for any PURA proceeding that covers electric, gas, or water. So I'm sure folks are most excited about using this in rate case proceedings, but there are many other types of proceedings that PURA puts on each year, especially under our Equitable Modern Grid framework. And other clean energy programs. So again, we're still waiting on our first applicant. We just finished designing this program in early January, and I really hope that folks attending today's webinar take the opportunity to check out the frequently asked questions and program application materials that are on our website. Okay. So to provide an update on PURA's Equitable Modern Grid framework work and some of our follow-on dockets, I want to start here. The Equitable Modern Grid framework was announced in the fall of 2019. And it started with what is pretty much a white paper that identified 11 different ways in which the grid could and should be modernized. And this is specifically the distribution grid. Ways in which we could alter our regulatory framework, stand up new programs, do different things, all with the goal in mind of creating a grid that is capable of supporting the goals that we have for the future. I think members of the public often hear goals discussed in terms of generation goals or supply goals. We talk about offshore wind, nuclear, things of that nature. But what I think sometimes gets short shrift in these conversations is understanding that you have to have the infrastructure in place that is capable of delivering the green supply to the end use customer. And there are a lot of resilience implications that come with that as well. And so that's what PURA's work is focused on, is making sure that the distribution grid itself is ready to contribute to those goals. So we established 4 objectives in that original framework document listed on the screen. Definitely some of these objectives can be viewed as in conflict with each other. We have a lot of conversations about affordability in this state, which are continuously difficult to have in light of the amount of investment that's required to sustain an equitable modern grid. So it's been interesting internally to PURA and also with our stakeholders to discuss how these objectives are balanced. So we have, there were 11 tracks in the first round of the Equitable Modern Grid. While we have completed roughly 10 and a half of them, and you may have heard about some of the outcomes of that work, I have, and my staff have offered presentations in other venues covering some of the outcomes of those works. So I wanted to focus on some of our more recent developments in today's slides. But if you are familiar with the Energy Storage Solutions Program, which provides incentives to offset the cost of installing batteries, if you're familiar with the Light Duty Electric Vehicle Charging Program, if you have seen some of the work coming out of our Reliability and Resilience docket, which focused on, among other things, laying the groundwork to start talking about a long-term undergrounding strategy. There are the low-income discount rate. These are all outputs of the first 11 tracks of the Equitable Modern Grid, and they've been stood up for some years now. So I would invite you to learn more about that. We have presentations recorded on our YouTube channel. I'm also happy to refer you to our specific web pages. Today, I want to talk about some of the outgrowths of the Equitable Modern Grid, because while it started with 11 tracks, we have expanded it to many, many more follow-on dockets. So the first one I want to highlight for folks, because this is pretty new and I'm not sure that folks are familiar with this work yet, interconnection policy. So interconnection was one of the first 11 tracks of the Equitable Modern Grid. We did focus then mostly on standing up working groups, and that would enable policy and technical discussions and integrating best practices from other states. One of the outputs of that working group was a recognition that interconnection cost allocation is becoming an increasing barrier to the deployment of distributed energy resources like solar, both for residential customers and non-residential customers. So we split this work into two dockets, one focused on residential, one on non-residential. The residential one is shown on this screen. So historically, and I, as Mark mentioned in the introduction, I came from the state of Maryland, so I'll use that first as an example. So this is a decade ago, and the Eastern Shore of Maryland is particularly well suited for solar deployment. And we had developers coming to the Public Service Commission, which is PURA's equivalent there, saying, you know, something has to be done because we're not able to sell any more solar on the Eastern Shore, because every time we go to site a rooftop solar, that customer is told at the step of interconnection that they're going to have to pay tens of thousands of dollars to upgrade, you know, a transformer or something else, because so many other people on that same circuit who had gone before them and now triggered, you know, the cumulative effect of everyone adding solar in that neighborhood now is going to cause a transformer upgrade. And the policies that most states have leave that last consumer as the one responsible for paying for the upgrade in order to interconnect their rooftop solar. And what we've since recognized in the state of Connecticut is that there's a fundamental fairness issue with that, because it's not that specific consumer who's the only one that's going to benefit from that upgraded utility equipment. It's going to, certainly the folks who installed solar before them are benefiting from it, and just non-participants in the program, but that are also utility customers, are going to benefit. So what we have done through this docket process that we had a lot of stakeholder input into was create a new policy that goes into effect April 1st, so just a few days from now, that is going to seek to proactively address what could otherwise become a barrier as we have an increasing amount of solar, particularly clustered in specific neighborhoods. So it's got a two-part policy. We have made some specific accommodations for customers that are located in environmental justice communities, because just to take a step back, if you're familiar with President Biden's Justice 40 initiative, all of our programs are designed around that Justice 40 initiative, which means at a very high level that we are trying to design the programs in a way to ensure that at least 40% of the benefits are being realized in communities that have been historically disadvantaged. So continuing that principle here, we have set the policy up so that if a transformer or other upgrade is needed in an environmental justice community, those costs are going to be rate-based, which means socialized across all ratepayers. And then for the cost of transformer upgrades in non-EJ communities, we've set up a program, a rule such that folks are paying a little bit each time they're applying to interconnect their solar, so that we're essentially collecting a share of the costs from each ratepayer along the way. And then there is remaining costs that we think might be left over that will then be socialized. But it's designed to be a much more equitable distribution of costs, so that we're not faced with customers who want solar but can't afford solar because they could afford the solar on their roof, but they can't afford the transformer upgrade. So you may be wondering, okay, well, that deals with residential customers, but what about the non-residential side, which in some ways can trigger even more challenges? If you've done work in Massachusetts or followed their policies, they had some challenges there as solar became more prevalent there. So I can't say too much about this docket because it is underway at PURA. So another thing that comes along with us being a quasi-judicial agency is that we have rules such, they're called ex parte, which means that I'm prohibited from discussing or speculating how PURA might rule on an issue. So I can tell you what we've done to date and invite you to follow along with this docket or weigh in if it's of interest to you. But we have issued a straw proposal, which is basically a fancy word for PURA staff have put together what they think could be a way to solve this issue, and they've put that out for comment. We have received initial rounds of comments, which my staff are actively looking at. And have definitely some ideas about how we could address this problem moving forward. But it's the same basic problem that I just walked through on the residential side, just at a greater scale that can happen more rapidly. So another outcrop of the equitable modern grid work is in the performance-based regulation space. The two aren't always tied together publicly, although I think when I think about them, I think of them as very interconnected. The equitable modern grid, as I mentioned, was a framework that was launched in 2019, and it's focused on achieving certain outcomes or enabling certain outcomes, and is very much structured around the achievement of specific objectives. So PBR is similar to that and really seeks to build on that work. So so what is PBR? And performance-based regulation, PBR for short. To answer that question, you need to get grounded a little bit. Promise not to go on too long about traditional utility regulation. Given a couple of bullets here to try to ground you. In the traditional way of utility regulation, it's called cost of service. And so basically that means, oversimplifying obviously, but basically the way that utilities are compensated is to recover the amount of their capital investment plus the opportunity to earn a reasonable rate of return. It looks backwards and assesses whether the utility has made a prudent and reasonable investment, and then allows them to recover that cost plus the opportunity to earn a reasonable rate of return. Performance-based regulation, and there are different flavors of it. Certainly across the country, different states have dipped their toes in it, have adopted aspects of it. The legislature has asked us via legislation that came out after Tropical Storm Isaias a couple years ago. They've asked us to go into what I would describe as more of a full-throated transition to performance-based regulation that's much more comparable to the efforts that were undertaken in Hawaii a couple of years ago. And PBR at its core seeks to kind of change the traditional cost of service or build on it, and set objectives that and priority outcomes that we want as a society, what we want the utility to achieve through the provision of utility service. So to ground this a little bit more, the work that PURA has been undertaking has been done in two phases. The first phase is completed. It was completed April last year. We spent about 18 months working with stakeholders, and we had members of the public join us for several listening sessions. And the goal of that first phase was to establish the goals of that we want the utilities to realize through PBR, so that in the second phase, we could design performance incentive mechanisms and regulatory mechanisms that are designed specifically to achieve these goals. So the first four goals that were adopted in that decision are listed on this screen. They were grouped into these buckets here. And after that, we launched into our phase 2 proceedings, which are ongoing. So again, For ex parte reasons, I'm going to tell you what we've done so far and not speculate what we're going to do, but just to describe to you what's in each of those buckets in case these are some of the docket numbers that you might want to follow along for. That first bucket deals with revenue adjustment mechanisms. So again, these are looking at the different tools that we have in our toolkit that can help send signals, price signals, regulatory signals to the utilities about how to achieve those goals. The second bucket's focused on performance mechanisms. So these are things that you might be more familiar with. They're called PIMs for short, performance incentive mechanisms. They can look at both upsides and downsides, so incentives or penalties. But in addition to those, you can also create scorecards. You can provide more transparency by tracking certain metrics. And then in the third and final bucket, this is where we really view PBR and the Equitable Modern Grid culminating. It's our integrated distribution system planning docket. So this is the docket in which we're trying to bring everything under one roof. And for that reason, it's on a little bit of a staggered schedule with the others. And this is the area in which we're trying to provide increased transparency into how we collectively plan for the future. And there's been some really great work to date already in these dockets. So and some products that are live on the street today. You may have had an opportunity to look at hosting capacity maps, for example, that indicate where on the grid we might be able to more readily interconnect EVs or solar. So there's some milestones along the way that have been realized already. Additionally, so even though we've completed the majority of work from our Equitable Modern Grid dockets, that doesn't mean the work's over. So the programs are all designed to be iterative and to take constant feedback into how they are designed and how they are working. So we have annual reviews. So even though the residential renewable energy solutions, or RRES for short, and non-residential renewable energy solutions, or NRES for short, the solar programs that are listed on the first three lines here, including SCEF, these are legislatively mandated programs. They're successors to some of our previous solar programs, but we have really folded them into the umbrella with our Equitable Modern Grid work. All of these programs that have been stood up have annual reviews, and they all receive docket numbers, which are essentially the serial numbers. Allows you to track these dockets. If you're one of the stakeholders that have no insight into how we set up docket numbers, you're not alone. I'll let you in on a secret here. They're always structured in this way with 6 numbers. The first 2 numbers are the last 2 numbers of the year. So dockets initiated in 2024 are going to start with 24 dash, and then the middle number is the month in which most of the work is going to start. And then the last 2 numbers are just the number that it has come in that month. But to try to make sure that stakeholders who are interested in this work from year to year are able to follow us, we have made all of our annual review dockets have the same numbers every year. The only number that changes is the year in which it was initiated. So if you're looking for this year's docket on RRES, it's 240802, for example. So I'm flagging this to you because if you have ideas for how these programs can be improved, ideas, whether that's ranging from incentives to specific program manual changes, it is always an opportunity for you to provide comments to us and into these dockets. Again, PURA is a creature of statute, so there are certain aspects of these programs that are mandated in statute that we cannot change without legislative authorization. Most notably, the megawatt caps in the solar programs are prescribed by statute. But generally things that flow from that, around the auctions, those are things that are available for comment in our programs. And then the last couple of slides, and I'll then turn it back to Mark for questions. or for our next agenda item. I just want to make sure that folks are aware of resources that Pura offers, because if I didn't touch on something that you're interested in, that you want to know more about, or you want to follow our work moving forward, we have started increasing pretty rapidly and consistently our public facing resources. So this is the second year that we have issued our clean and renewable energy report. It comes out in February of each year, and it is a compilation of all the data that we have on ratepayer funded clean and renewable energy programs. We do solicit data from our colleagues at DEEP regarding ratepayer funded power purchase agreements. So we've tried to make it a one-stop shop if you're looking for information or data on how those programs are performing. So again, we've issued 2 iterations of this. This one just came out last month. My staff did a webinar on it with some deep dives into some of what happened in 2023. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel. Clearly everyone has accessed Zoom successfully today. So I'm really excited and encouraged by the amount of work that we're able to push out through our YouTube channel. My staff have done some really great short videos on the more dense topics. The screenshots on here show the webinar I was referencing about our annual report. We have started producing materials in Spanish as well. So we have some brief tutorials about how to read your bill. We have some tutorials on how to enroll with a third-party supplier. All of our voting meetings are recorded there, and we also post our performance-based regulation proceedings to that page. Would encourage you to subscribe and check out some of those materials. Another opportunity here, and when you receive these slides, the hyperlinks are active. We have started publishing quarterly newsletters. So these are trying to do 2 things. It takes a retrospective look at dockets that were completed in the last quarter and gives a brief synopsis of what those decisions covered. And then it also tells you the dockets that we expect to be active in the next quarter. As I mentioned at the top of the presentation, there are 80 to 100 active dockets. We certainly don't expect you to be able to track all of them. So we've tried to color code these quarterly newsletters so that you can say, like, I'm only interested in electric dockets. I'm going to go to that section, and it lists the public comment opportunities or hearings that we have upcoming in that next quarter. So again, these are still a fairly new work product. We've been issuing them for about a year. So I would welcome input on the readability, accessibility of these. They're still not quite Pura 101. They do still use a lot of jargon. So we're working to see if we can, break this down even further. But really would welcome your feedback on these newsletters. I already talked about the annual report. Would encourage you to go check that out, as well as last year's iteration. And with that, I'm going to stop. I have some appendix slides in case I get any specific questions about other programs I didn't touch on. But for now, I'm going to turn it back over to Mark.
Great. Thank you, Marissa. That's really very clear. And we've got a lot of, I think, really good questions. What I would suggest is let's do some questions now, maybe focusing on the ones that are more of understanding. Some of the longer, discussion questions, maybe if we don't get to everything, we'll have this fireside chat with Representative Steinberg, and then we will have a chance to come back to some more questions. But some of the questions that came up that you may are more of an understanding: is the Stakeholder Compensation Fund available for siting council cases?
Oh, great question. So the Siting Council is not part of Pura. So currently the Stakeholder Compensation Program applies to Pura proceedings. I do know that there's quite a lot of activity at the legislature this session around Siting Council. So I won't speculate whether they would extend the program there, but right now the Stakeholder Compensation Program is specific to Pura proceedings.
You talked about a new policy and approach for interconnection costs on residential. Does that apply to community solar projects, or I guess SCEF in this case?
Oh, great question. So the second docket I talked about, the one that's ongoing for the non-residential, SCEF is more appropriately probably thought of in that arena rather than the residential space, even though SCEF are serving residential subscribers. Subject to check, I would say that the SCEF program interconnection would be more appropriately thought of in the non-residential docket, which is ongoing.
Is executive compensation, presumably of the utilities, regulated by PURA?
Ah, um, a couple of different ways to approach this question. Um, the executive compensation itself, so the CEO of a utility, PURA does not and cannot set that rate specifically for a couple of reasons. The utilities that serve state of Connecticut customers, so Eversource UI, their parent companies have affiliates in many other states, and they also have unregulated businesses. So the executives at that parent company level, they are being compensated, from lots of different pots. So we would not be able to reach up to the CEO of Eversource and say you can't pay him any more than X, number of dollars. What we can do, and this is, kind of coming out of the legislature's Take Back Our Grid Act, which put us on the path to performance-based regulation. It does empower PURA to say, for any executive compensation that is recovered in rates, so any portion of an executive's compensation that a Connecticut ratepayer is paying for in their rates, we can tie to the achievement of certain metrics. So we started exercising that authority in rate cases last year. So in the Aquarian rate case, and then followed by the United Illuminating rate case, in both of those rate cases, we have set up metrics. And if I'm not mistaken, they were both around achievement of certain affordability metrics. So basically, the companies cannot recover in rates a certain amount of executive compensation until and unless those metrics that we decided are achieved.
Great, thank you. How about methane pipelines? There's a question. Are there mechanisms to assure that methane pipelines are monitored and repaired?
Yes. So there are a couple of different programs in the natural gas space. There's something called DIMP, which is Distribution Infrastructure Management Program, I think, which prioritizes the replacement of certain types of pipe and accelerates the replacement of that pipe. And that's done on a lot of different risk factors. Some of them include the types of leaks that infrastructure is experiencing. So the utilities have the local distribution companies, so Yankee Gas, Southern, and Connecticut Natural Gas, they each have a DIMP program. There are also a couple of different ways that Pure monitors this space. So there's a concept called the lost and unaccounted for gas, LOF gas. We have to produce an annual report. This is more of an accounting exercise. So there's basically you're looking at whether the utilities can account for all the gas that entered their system. And sometimes they can't for accounting reasons, billing cycle issues. Sometimes they can't because of leaks. So anytime that the LOF gas exceeds more than 3% for a utility, it triggers a further investigation. So those are a couple of ways off the top of my head. Other ways that ratepayers who might care about this topic could get involved are certainly we look at these types of things in rate cases. So if you are a customer of Southern or CNG, they're in for a rate case right now. The docket number is 231102. So you're definitely welcome to follow along with that docket or comment there.
Great. I know a topic that's of interest to us all is the automated metering equipment or smart meters, and when might we see a true time of use rate program?
So the second track of Pura's Equitable Modern Grid was focused on the strategic deployment of AMI. That docket has been recently completed. So the United Illuminating Company has, I think, a pretty high penetration in the high 90s at this point in terms of first generation smart meters that have been deployed. Um, so this decision covered two things. It sent guidance to both of the utilities, no matter the stage that they are at with deploying smart meters, about the ways in which Pura would the types of things that we want to see out of AMI. AMI infrastructure is a very hefty investment, and so you want to make sure that the infrastructure associated with smart meters is capable of doing things like advanced TOU rates. So one of the things that we outlined in that January decision were our next steps around time of use rates, and specifically the parameters around that proposal that we are looking to see from the utilities when they move forward with AMI. So I think it's a little bit tough of a question to answer with a specific time, because it's dependent in part on when particularly Eversource moves forward with the AMI deployment. But Pura has gone on record with parameters of what we would expect to see for a time of use rate program.
Great. And I know another topic that's on a lot of people's minds is interconnection queues. And the question is, how difficult is it for new producers to interconnect to the grid? What is the backlog, the cost of interconnection, and what progress has been made to improve this situation?
Whew, so I'd say if we're talking about the interconnection queues for uh, so there are two types of interconnection queues. There's one that is regulated by the regional grid operator. So these would govern, larger projects. So those are definitely outside of Pura's purview. But for the interconnection queues that we're thinking about more at the behind interconnection behind the meter projects, so the topic of interconnection has obviously been a hot topic at Pura over the past year or so, as I spent some of my slides on that. And I would say that I'm confident and optimistic that some of the cost allocation policies that we have designed and continue to work on for the non-residential space should start to alleviate some of those concerns. The annual program review dockets that I listed also have spent a lot of time, particularly last year, focused on internal to the utility coordination between their different metering and interconnection departments, and we've sent guidance through those decisions. So if this is a matter of importance to the person who has posed the question, I would definitely encourage you to sign up to follow this year's iteration of those dockets, because I think interconnection challenges will continue to be monitored in each of those DER dockets specifically.
Terrific. So there are more questions, but we will have some time at the end to have additional questions. Thank you for your willingness to really take all questions as they come. Um, what we'd like to do now is transition to our fireside chat. And as we said, we're very pleased to have Representative Jonathan Steinberg. And I believe Jonathan Steinberg and Chair Gillette know each other well, have worked together over a range of energy issues. We had a conversation like this a few years ago in a webinar. It was very well received. So I would invite Representative Steinberg, if you haven't done so already, unmute yourself and if
Oh, I test the system.
great.
May I start by saying that I really admire many things about Pura and the chair, but coming up with the name Equitable Modern Grid to me is really kind of hot. I mean, I would like to see a glossy magazine called Equitable Modern Grid with beautiful photographs of substations and linemen working lines. Wouldn't we all subscribe to that? Maybe do an interview with a lineman. You know, this is how we bring Connecticut in the modern age of our energy future, by having really smart people talk about things like an equitable modern grid. And by the way, with some direction from the legislature and from DEEP, doing all the hard work. If you look at the litany of dockets that Pura has taken on, they are looking out for us. They are looking out for our energy future. And we're very lucky to have them. We're at the advent of a new age, which is going to bring a fair bit of pain along with some real benefits to people. But thank goodness we have Pura at this time looking out for our interests. And it's in everyone's interests to continue to support the work that Pura does. And I want to say something else. Pura is not anybody's adversary. Pura has a job to do to adjudicate that which rules that we have asked them to put in place. For them to be in a situation where they are viewed as anything short as a partner to all the parties involved is really not where we need to be right now. And I'm really hoping that, particularly coming off the recent judicial ruling with regard to Aquarian, that maybe we're now finally past the point where we have to be spending all our time with lawyers rather than getting projects built that are going to benefit ratepayers. I'll leave it at that.
Great. Maybe a question, in that context, we're facing this is not just business as usual, right? We are, in addition to fixing an aging grid, which is a process that we've had to do for 100 years. We're facing this really transition, this revolution in the way we produce energy, how we use energy. So that creates, of course, uncertainty. I mean, and I guess a question for either of Chair Gillette or Representative Steinberg. To what extent can a utility, looking at this new landscape, can they navigate that? Can they be assured that, yes, we're going to have to make a lot of new investments, but there are procedures in place? I mean, certainly the energy landscape is changing. Have the rules of how Pura approves investments, has that changed, or have we moved the goalposts, or how can we, the public and any utility, think about transitioning to this new future?
Well, I'm not going to talk about the process part. I think one thing that Chair Gillette said with regard to that is they're constantly reviewing what they're doing. You saw the chart which talked about end of year reviews for all our major programs. So, process can always be improved on. I think we all felt there were maybe some dislocations going from the REC paradigm to the new NRES-SCEF paradigm. But I have high confidence that Pura is very self-aware, if that's the right word, about how things are going. Certainly, they get plenty of feedback from parties across the board, and that this is not something that is static. This is something that is constantly moving forward. And that's very important, as you pointed out, because we're at maybe a series of what I would call inflection points going on broadly with both supply and delivery of energy. We need to get our act together, and we need to get all the players rowing in the same direction. We're going to do that. So attention to process, the ability to adapt to a rapidly changing landscape, that kind of nimbleness is something we require. And thankfully, Pura, even with its very limited resources that really need to be enhanced, has been able to make adjustments, at least in my view. I mean, I should be angry at Pura, because every time I come up with a good idea, I find out Pura is already doing that. I mean, it's really embarrassing for a legislator to find out they're anticipating our needs based upon our sometimes inchoate instructions on what we want them to do. So, for the most part, I count on them as partners to help us figure out what do we do now. I mean, we have no shortage of challenges right now, but having Pura in the room, along with Deep, along sometimes with the utilities, is the only way we're going to chart a path, and that has to do with, as we were talking about earlier, interconnection points, how we make EV charging happen, how do we really bring on offshore wind. Maybe someday we'll get AMI. Certainly that's something that I think would benefit ratepayers across the board. I would just like the utilities to stop spending money on lawyers and do the job and get compensated for it. There are so many things that need to be addressed at the same time. And it's really distressing, particularly because many of these things, by definition, are going to raise ratepayer rates. That's just reality. Thankfully, there's a lot of federal dollars on the table to mitigate some of that. But we need to really be in lockstep with not only Pura and Deep, but the utilities if we're going to move forward on our agenda and protect ratepayers, not just in terms of rates, but in terms of reliability, which is a bigger and bigger issue going forward. Obviously, I'm horning in on the entire fireside chat here. So I'm going to stop. Clearly legislators are not good at sharing the spotlight.
I don't find that to be the case. Thank you, Chair Steinberg. I would, certainly start by echoing everything that he just said. And Chair Steinberg's touched on in his opening remarks, alluding to a court victory earlier this week. And just if folks haven't had an opportunity to read about that, the Superior Court upheld Pura's rate-making decision with respect to Aquarion, which had been appealed last year. I really think that decision drove home that, Pura has the expertise and the broad discretion to be setting these rates. And more importantly, the rules of the road have not changed. We're applying longstanding legal principles. And while we are continuing through the annual review dockets to iterate and incorporate best practices, that has not changed longstanding principles of utility regulation. Where we are looking forward is in the performance-based regulation dockets, which again encourage folks to look there. Really, when we have talked to members of the investment community through these dockets, we had a panel probably a year and a half ago now, where investors who had been involved in the transition to performance-based regulation in Hawaii and the utility there, spoke a lot about the, things settling down once they understood the rules of the road and got certainty from what the state was looking for. So for many reasons, I think PBR continues to be an opportunity where we can be transparent about what we're looking for and explaining, how to what we want to see achieved, and tying compensation to the achievement of those outcomes. So I think that's a really great opportunity for us all to continue to engage through those proceedings. Again, they're ongoing. There's still a lot of runway in front of us through at least the rest of this year. So plenty of opportunities to engage as members of the public and kind of inform where we're going there.
There was a question in the chat. This relates to some comments that you just made, Chair Gillette. To what extent do utilities actually, that's not the right question, is when a utility invests in infrastructure that has been approved, are they guaranteed reimbursement? And and again, to this point, a lot of the infrastructure that utilities are starting to make or will be making in the future are new, right? They're not things that we've done before. So, if it's been approved, will utilities still get a guaranteed rate of return? And to what extent do they know that going, ahead, before they make that investment?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in traditional cost of service regulation, you're not approving a utility's infrastructure up front. They are making an investment based on how they, as a utility, think the business should be operated. And there are some legal standards, and we often use the words prudent, used and useful. These are legal standards that have decades, if not a century, of legal precedent behind them. Where you're looking at the investment, and in these rate case proceedings, you're taking evidence that where the utility is trying to demonstrate from a factual perspective that the investment that they made was prudent, reasonable, and is now used and useful and in service. And so, the justification for them receiving the opportunity to earn a reasonable rate of return is because you're trying to capture, in part, the risk that they have borne by making those investments, and compensating the utility and its shareholders for allowing those investments to be made. So, part of what you do in a rate case, and just speaking in the abstract, is you're looking at the risk tolerance of all of the parties, and balancing that with the interests of ratepayers. And we have other standards like that you have to set rates that are no more than is needed. You have to look at the financial health of the companies. So balancing all of those aspects and trying to quantify how much risk the utility is actually facing is kind of what factors into those rate of return calculations. So, with this question specifically, where you're asking if the utility receives a rate of return based on the approval, I guess what I'm trying to say is the utility is not receiving approval up front, but rather they're being compensated for the risk that they've taken on of that. And they do have, to answer the question that you were just saying, how do they determine what needs to be invested in? It gets back to their statutory obligation. In exchange for a monopoly franchise agreement, by statute, they're obligated to provide safe, reliable, affordable service. So, they're balancing those obligations to determine the investment. And then they're coming in for a rate case and receiving compensation if those investments if they can prove that those investments were prudent and reasonable.
If I can just jump in, prudent and reasonable is being used a lot because they are terms of art in law. And I think they reflect a very central theme of what PBR is all about. The chair has explained that they do not get guaranteed compensation in advance. One might argue that under the old regime, they pretty much had that. In fact, there was actually an instance where one of the utilities asked for money to perform a particular task and then spend it on something else. Well, how should we feel as ratepayers when our utilities say, we asked for this money and we want a guaranteed return, but we didn't even spend the money on the thing that we promised we'd spend it on? And by going through settlements, rather than through full rate cases, they've been able on occasion to obscure this. What we did with Take Back the Grid Act, and most recently last year with SB 7, is institute a policy in which we can agree on the things that we'd like them to do, but they must do a good faith effort in doing these jobs, meaning both doing quality work and doing it on a timely basis if they expect maximum return on that investment. And there's just a whole lot of investments out there that could give them a pretty solid return if they just get started. And AMI is my bugaboo. We've been talking about it for years. I think that PURA has been pretty clear exactly on how best to go forward. There's talks about things like trackers, but as far as I'm concerned, they have their marching orders. If they want to make money, if they want to be able to tell their shareholders that there's profit in the future, accept the PBR regime, initiate these projects, and get compensated for good work. So when we keep talking about prudent and reasonable, this is something that you will see referred to more in statute as well. We want everything in the statutory language to be consistent so that there's no doubt, there's no wiggle room, there's no misunderstanding on the part of the utilities on how they will be compensated. And once they accept the regime for what it is, There's plenty of profit in this for them. There's plenty of opportunity going forward. We just need to get beyond this point where we're bickering about whether or not we can actually institute a new regime. And I think the courts said resoundingly that PURA is totally within its powers. And even if you read between the lines, even suggested that PURA is doing a good job in looking out for ratepayer interests. And that was on a case that relates to water, but it certainly applies to the electrical sector as well.
There's a bunch of questions that are going to go into the weeds a little bit on things like electric school buses or microgrids, and I want to come back to those. But on this sort of broader conversation, and I think this question, you've answered this a little bit, but I think it's another way of sort of getting at this conundrum. And the question is, who's doing the vision thing for residents of the state as well as businesses? Is it PURA? Is it the utilities? Should there be a higher power, perhaps in the governor's office or a governor's collaborative to look at long-term planning for both production and delivery? You talked about sort of making it clear what is expected for AMI. I mean, another big area where we're going to require all kinds of investments is distribution system planning, right? And, you know, I think you talked quite a bit about giving the direction, giving the guidance, but I don't know if there's any other comment you'd like to make along on this broader topic.
Well, first of all, we have to make sure that we include DEEP in all this conversation. You know, we created DEEP. We gave them that responsibility because we expected them to guide us on how best to achieve some of our objectives. The legislature can make manifest its desires, but we count on DEEP and PURA in its way to help flesh out, general goals and create programs that will help us achieve those goals. The utilities are our partners in this because we count on them because of their specific statutory role, monopolistic role, if you want to put it that way, to execute those, much as we ask PURA to execute aspects of policy. But to say that there's only one party looking out for the vision thing, it would be incorrect. We count on all the parties to contribute to that. And sometimes to push back, tell us, we may have a goal, but for example, I want to put solar on everything. PURA and DEEP tell me, well, that's going to cost you some money. Ratepayers are going to pay part of that burden. We're most effective when we're working interactively to fashion solutions together.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I would say, how I've tried to steer PURA over the past couple of years and how I think of this, Chair Steinberg paid me a compliment in the last answer about seeming like we were doing everything. And I'd say that the reason that I feel like we've been allowed to do that and to get into these spaces is because we do have some pretty clear direction from the legislative leaders, the administration, from DEEP. So, I think of those of us who are, in this community, like sometimes it's really tempting to think about everything that we still have to do, but we haven't. We shouldn't lose sight of how much we really have accomplished, as a group. And there have been some really great pieces of legislation. In 2021, there was a Public Act 2153 that set the 1,000 megawatt target for energy storage by the end of 2030. There's been that really great direction that allowed us to set up the successor programs for the solar. There have been MOUs and executive orders. There's the GC3. So there are lots of places that I, as the chair of PURA, are looking to and drawing from, and allow us to set up these programs. So when the legislature or DEEP or the administration act to send these, big, broad policy statements, what that allows us at PURA to do is to take that vision and translate it into a program. So sticking with that battery storage example, we took that 1,000 megawatt target, said, DEEP also received authorization in that legislation to do front of the meter procurements. So we carved out 580 megawatts of that target and said, we can design a 9-year program that will achieve the installation of 580 megawatts of storage. And then we could take that, into the weeds in terms of what incentive level needs to be offered to achieve that. So I think that's where we really look to our partners in the legislature, the administration, DEEP, and can draw from that. And if you go back and you read the framework document from 2019, or some of the authorizing decisions for the light duty electric vehicle program, for example, we've really drawn on that, some of those inspirational acts of signing MOUs, committing the state to trying to achieve a certain penetration of light duty EVs. We've really drawn on all of that, and that's how it translates into work at PURA.
Great. Someone has asked who tracks whether the utilities are maximizing opportunities under the Inflation Reduction Act.
Well, speaking of our friends at DEEP, I'll say first, PURA has in all of our equitable modern grid dockets, I think it's all of them at this point, issued decisions that specifically direct the utilities to apply for all relevant programs. There was another battery storage program that we wrapped up last year where UI has been authorized to do 3 battery resilience projects in 3 different communities. And I know that they're actively applying for federal funding to support one of those projects. So we've definitely taken the steps in our decisions to make sure that the utilities are aware of and understand that the expectation is that they apply for all available funding. And we're taking those nods from the legislature. And I'll let Chair Steinberg elaborate on that. And then certainly our colleagues over at DEEP, specifically their Bureau of Energy Technology Policy, are really focused on tracking.
Yeah, I would agree. The federal dollars are in many ways a blessing. This is a once in a generation or perhaps several generation opportunity for us to be making critical infrastructure investments. And it's the only hope we have of making sure that the costs of what we must do to have an energy future are not borne exclusively by ratepayers. However, having said that, I've heard people at DEEP refer to the experience of trying to leverage the federal funds as like trying to drink from a fire hose. It's very complicated. The rules are often promulgated well after the big press conference on exactly what is available. So DEEP has been dancing as fast as it can to try to chase down grant dollars. In some cases, there's matching required, which has other implications. Many times the strings attached make it very complicated. Sometimes we assume we're going to get a grant and it turns out to be a credit, as we just learned recently on some spending. And equally importantly, not all this, it may flow through the state, but some of these things, for example, are really dedicated for municipalities. Are we doing a good enough job getting the word out to municipalities or other entities that there are monies out there that they can leverage? I was concerned that this fire hose, however you want to call it, was going to run out of water in the next year or two. As it turns out, a lot of these programs are going to be available for a good number of years into the 2030s. So there's still time for us to educate people, make sure that we are leveraging every program we can. This is an opportunity that I would really feel badly if we ended up squandering by not taking full advantage. For example, DEEP put a lot of resources as working as part of a consortium on getting a hydrogen hub, which would have been a lot of money and really interesting. We didn't get it. But that means that the resources they applied to that maybe could have been applied elsewhere. It's always the gamble when you make these kind of choices. I just think that the key takeaway from this is there's still opportunity to take advantage of federal dollars. And I think we all have a responsibility for sort of spreading the word when we hear about programs that might be applicable to people who want to use it. Let's get it done now. It may never come again.
Another question, is PURA doing anything to promote school bus electrification?
Fantastic. I can touch on 2 different things here. So we have a docket 210917, which is focused on the medium and heavy duty electrification. And we've been working with stakeholders on different ways in which we can try to replicate the success of the light duty electric vehicle program on the medium and heavy duty space, which certainly would extend to school buses. So there are some proposals pending around different rate design options, particularly since demand charges can be so problematic as you try to electrify larger fleets. So we have a technical meeting next Wednesday, which I believe is April 3rd, in the afternoon. So all the information about that is certainly available on our website if folks want to tune in and see what that's about. We do have time for stakeholder comments at the end of that. So that's one opportunity. We're actively investigating that. Another thing that I would really like to flag, our 5th track of the Equitable Modern Grid was our Innovative Energy Solutions Program, or IES for short. And it's people have maybe heard me talk about this elsewhere. It's a really exciting program, kind of mimics a regulatory sandbox. So, utility regulators are often find themselves on the receiving end of criticism for not being in a position to react quick enough. We're not nimble creatures by nature. So we've tried to enable innovation by setting up this program that kind of replicates Shark Tank, different types of pitch fests, and we're in the middle of the first cycle now. And essentially we have $25 million of funding each year to incentivize these pilot programs that vendors can either partner with the utilities or come in on their own. And one of the 7 pilots that was approved under the first phase is specifically looking at the electrification of a school bus fleet. And I apologize, I can't remember if it's in UI's or Eversource's territory right now. I want to say UI's. But that pilot has just completed the contracting stage. And the whole purpose of this program is that it provides a space in which the vendor can pilot its program for 12 to 18 months. And if at the conclusion of that pilot, there is success, there is an opportunity to scale it up to the rest of the state. So yes, the short answer is yes, we are doing work in the school bus electrification space through both pilots and larger rate design efforts.
If I could just add, school buses are one aspect of the front line of the political battle going on with electrification. The person who posed this question, his very town rejected the idea of electric school buses because they didn't have enough energy to meet the needs according to the school district. That is unfortunate. It may describe the fact that depending upon the uses of your school bus, how frequently it has to run in the day before it recharges, it might not be there. You also heard a lot of talk about school buses being way too expensive, and they may be unaffordable for certain communities. But this is part of a larger strophe, undermining the concept of electrifying anything, starting with EVs. And we just saw in the legislature an effort to undermine our efforts to adopt the California medium and heavy duty truck emission standards. It's true that we are not there yet. And the things we are trying to encourage reflect the fact that if we as a state make certain commitments to innovation, to electrification, that will support these industries. Their costs will come down, so they'll be more affordable because there'll be more orders for these kind of products. And importantly, that will lead to greater innovation, which will lead to longer battery lives and more effective recharging technologies and all those different kinds of things. So I just want to impress upon what I think is a friendly audience that we need your help to counter the propaganda that's out there that's basically undermining our desire to electrify everything. I will say that with the caveat, there is a genuine concern about capacity over the next 10, 15 years in terms of the amount of electricity we will need. We need to manage that. We need to focus on conservation, the things like AMI will bring us. But we cannot use the excuse that we might have some challenges on the supply side to abandon our agenda for electrification. We have to be judicious about it. I think we see the industry making some adjustments on that as well. But suffice it to say, we are losing the rhetorical battle right now, and I think that we all have a responsibility to counter it.
Couple questions on microgrids. One of the participants cited a Sierra Magazine article about microgrids being a necessary part of the energy infrastructure. Is anything being considered in Connecticut? Another question was, is there support for private development of microgrids?
Uh,
Well, I'm just going to say we've done a bad job on microgrids and let Chair Gillette amplify that.
Oh, well, I was about to say that microgrids are in the jurisdiction of DEEP, so I feel like yes, set me up for. um, Pura's work in the microgrid space is limited. The microgrid program and the bonding that the state offers is done through DEEP and our partners over in BETP. So where Pura interacts with microgrids is more on the bits and pieces that go into that. So certainly, fuel cells that are eligible for some of our programs, battery storage, aspects of aspects of the microgrid are being incented through our programs. And then certainly that Innovative Energy Solutions program that I touched on could be theoretically a possibility for some kind of microgrid pilot through that. I'd have to think more about it. But that Innovative Energy Solutions program opens every January for a new suite of proposals. So those are the things that come to mind immediately that are within Pura's wheelhouse.
Okay, we are almost out of time. There are several questions, though, about storage, and you just mentioned that is something you have worked on. Let me just read some of these. Is there a list of state-qualified large-scale battery storage companies? How will large-scale battery storage electricity consumer costs be regulated? These companies are not generating electricity or distributing it, but storing excess and releasing it. And speaking of batteries, should SCEF be changed to incentivize the pairing of solar with batteries, as Massachusetts has done so successfully with its community solar program? So there's a college course on storage right there.
Wow. I love good ideas, and the chair and I need to talk about doing something with SCEF in that regard. I just wanted to add, and I'll yield to the chair, that battery storage is something that Connecticut is beginning to excel at. We have a couple companies that are actually manufacturing, lithium batteries here in the state, innovative batteries that will hopefully help revolutionize the industry. And they are certainly scalable to all the way up to grid scale, but can also be used at all sorts of different levels. This is an opportunity area for us. I think everybody agrees that I'd love to see a quantum leap forward on energy batteries that would get us out of the lithium or precious metals business and into something that would be far less expensive and environmentally problematic. But for right now, we are actually in a position to take advantage of more storage and deal with the intermittency problem. I think we're still at the very earliest stages of emphasizing storage. As the chair mentioned, we've given both Pura and DEEP responsibilities before and behind the meter on those kind of projects. And we're just at the early stage. I would actually say Pura is a little ahead of DEEP on this by a little bit, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. This is just us just getting started. And now I'll hand it off.
Thank you. I would encourage folks to go to energystorageCT.com, which is a dedicated website that covers the energy storage solutions program that Pura has designed and is co-administered by the Green Bank and the utilities. And our program really focuses on behind the meter installations and I know some of the questions were more about grid scale or front of the meter. We'll say that we have a front of the meter tariff that that is out for comment right now. I believe that would seek to provide some more of that rate design guidance for larger scale battery programs. So we'll certainly reference that for people's interest. And generally speaking, just remark that all of PURA's Equitable Modern Grid proceedings, the programs that have been designed, the solar programs, the storage program, the EV program, they're all designed to interact with each other. So whether we make any formal changes to SCEF or not, the program, sorry, I'm an elderly cat who has a lot to say all of a sudden. The programs are all designed to interact with each other. So like at the individual customer basis, for example, you can oversize your residential solar system if you anticipate that you're going to electrify your home heating or add EV chargers. So we have designed the programs to work together, whether or not we take any more affirmative steps.
Well, terrific. We are over in time, and I just want to take a moment to really, we are so fortunate to have public servants like Chairman Gillette and Representative Steinberg so willing to take time and answer questions and explore these topics. Thank you both for taking time today and more broadly for the good work you do helping transition Connecticut to a clean energy future. So thank you all for attending. We will, I did put a note in the chat. Be sure to sign up for the PACE newsletter. It comes out every week and it's chock full of clean energy news and events. We will be sending you all an email with links to everything from today, the slides, the recording, the chat, and probably some other resources that we've discovered along the way. So thank you all for taking part today.